Well, speaking of bringing developers in, obviously I have to ask you about Swift because
Hmm.
that's been like a weird thing I've heard about the project wanting to shift towards. And I have a little bit of Swift experience. I've done a little bit of iOS development in the past, but uh, why? I think is the easiest question. Why?
Right. So we want to, in the long term, we want to find a solution for the typical safety and security problems that plague browsers.
Hmm.
Um, we have a code base in C++ today because that's what Serenity OS was, because that's what I knew when I started it. Um, and so we've evolved into a large C++ project.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it seems that C++, the language, is not willing to evolve um, safety features, at least not of the scale and scope that would be considered appropriate, let's say,
Hmm.
in this day and age.
Right.
And so we have to look for sort of a solution for the future where we can keep our current code base,
Hmm.
but incrementally um, add safety features so that we can be sure that we are building a secure piece of software, I
Hmm.
suppose. That's sort of the motivation for it. Like we're trying to think long term. We need a solution for the safety and security issue in the long term. And then we looked at the different alternatives for that. And I what we did was I asked people to try prototyping different pieces of the code base in
Hmm.
different languages. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but we tried Rust, and initially people were quite excited about it because a lot of hype around the
Hmm.
language. But inevitably, every single person that I asked to prototype in it um, became frustrated in one way or another.
Hmm.
That it just kind of didn't um, either like didn't map to the kind of problems that we wanted to solve,
Hmm.
and it was cumbersome to work with, and it just it didn't feel like a good fit in our code base. And um, Swift was another language that people were initially very suspicious of.
Hmm.
Um, I even had a slightly hard time getting people to try it because they were like, "Oh, what's this Apple thing?" Um, but then when they tried it, they came back saying like, "Oh, well, this is so incredibly pleasant.
Hmm.
It fits into our code base kind of perfectly. It maps to our coding style, and it has language level support for the features that we use. It's like very object oriented. Rust is not object oriented,
Hmm.
and Swift has a lot of flaws, but um, it is object oriented. We are object oriented, and most importantly of all, they have an actively developing C++ interoperability story.
Hmm.
So the Swift team is like very actively, very consciously trying to become sort of the C++ successor language. So they are adding
Hmm.
features to their language, and they tell people, we want to be the language that you add to your C++ code base when you want to evolve into a modern language. So they allow you to interact directly with C++. Like you can call C++ functions back and forth. Now, in practice, this is not all roses.
Right.
It's not completely mature, and we have certainly run into issues with trying the C++ interop ourselves. We've reported a bunch of bugs, and we still have yet to begin sort of expansive use of Swift in our code base because of sort of remaining interoperability riddles that we haven't solved yet.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the what it really came down to was that everybody just kind of liked it,
Hmm.
and they didn't enjoy Rust. And the Rust people are not always great at hearing this. Um, yeah, I guess I don't need to say more than that. um, anyway, yes, we tried
Yes.
those languages. We also tried some other languages.
Hmm.
we are not interested in language war. So when people ask like, "Well, did you try my favorite language? Here's why you should use my favorite language." We just say like,
Where's
"Yeah,
Zig?
don't worry
Why
about it."
not
Yeah.
Zig? The Zig people are the new Rust people. I remember when I was in university. That was when Rust was like first getting attention. There was one guy I knew who was the Rust evangelist. This was before there was any Rust jobs. No one was doing professional Rust work yet, but he was the guy. He was the guy who would constantly tell me about it. I have people doing the same thing right now with Zig, and I'm sure there's going to be a future for it somewhere. But like there are some people that get very, very hung up on the language rather than what is the best tool for the job.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of our thinking is that what is the best tool for the job? What are we really trying to achieve?
Mm,
And if I'm perfectly honest, what I would love to happen is I could just have C++ plus plus with a garbage collector for memory safety.
mm-hmm,
Um, because then everything would just work the way that it already does. And the garbage collector would prevent us from committing memory sins. Um, but C++ plus plus doesn't come with a garbage collector. So, and neither does Swift or Rust, by the way.
mm-hmm.
And the web platform requires a garbage collector because of JavaScript. So
Right.
it's just something that you have to provide somehow. And if I were to start over today, for the record, I would build this whole thing in a garbage collected language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not really an option at this time.
If you had that option, what language would you go with?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Um, I would have to I would have to mess around and see what the landscape looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm sure there is one. I'm afraid that I would end up with Java, but I would like to look around first. Um, yeah. No, I think in general, in my experience as a programmer professionally, for the last 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
there's always been a language that people are extremely hyped about, and they think the whole world should be rewritten in this language. And every year, it's um, like an election to choose the new language for that year.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, when I was first starting out in the 90s, Java was like that language that everybody should rewrite in.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, like C sharp, and like it's been
I remember
trading
before
back and
Rust
forth.
was like really the hype thing. Everyone was talking about Go.
Yeah, Go for a time, yeah. And, there's always, like, an energy like that, and I
Sure.
think it's a good thing that people get hyped on new technologies and new inventions,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it's important to understand that these are fads, to an extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't take away from the sort of technical achievement of new languages with
Sure.
new ideas, but there is a fad component, and there's also sort of football hooligan component to these things,
Mm.
um, and it's a little off-putting, to be honest, especially as somebody who's getting a little older, a little tired of the football hooligan aspect of language
Mm-hmm.
evangelism, let's say. But that ultimately that doesn't really factor into our choice to use Swift.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like comfortable to use it.
Now, one thing you brought up that I can't let you go by, I can't let you go by without bringing it back up. Um,
Mhm.
Object oriented. People are very, very, very opinionated about programming paradigms, and object oriented is usually the one that's very maligned.
Mhm.
Why is it an OO code base?
So the web platform
Mm-hmm.
was born in the 1990s
Mm-hmm.
when OO was like the rage, right? Um, and a lot of the central APIs and object models in a browser are object oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And because of compatibility, they just don't change. And
Right.
so fundamentally, the engine that we have to build for the web is built around objects that talk to each other in very typical object-oriented ways. And so it's just the most straightforward programming paradigm to implement a browser engine in.
Mm-hmm.
It just maps beautifully to the specs. One of the things that we do, I haven't talked about that in Ladybird, is that to sort of one of the many things that we do to alleviate the maintenance burden is that we try to implement our code so that it looks exactly like the spec, or as close to the spec as possible,
I did see
down
you
to like,
complaining
yeah.
about the spec on Twitter the other day about the spec not exactly being the what is actually the actual way it's supposed to be.
Right, right. So the web specifications are supposed to match what browsers are really doing,
Mm-hmm.
and when that's not the case, sometimes the spec has to change, sometimes the browser has to change.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody gets together and they have to decide like which way is it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, like all the other browsers, when they implement a spec, they sort of tend to freestyle a lot. Like they read the spec and they see like, okay, so this is what's supposed to happen.
Uh-huh.
I will implement this in my favorite way, that in a way that I think makes sense. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's for like personal taste reasons, or maybe it fits into the programming model that they have in their browser or whatever. Um, we have tried to evolve our programming model so that it can look literally like the spec as much as possible. So that if you're like reading our code out loud, it matches almost word for word what's in the spec.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's not always possible or practical, obviously,
Sure.
but a ton of our code does look like that. And that's just so much more maintainable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is our thesis, at least, um, that years from now, when we have to go back and work on this stuff, hey, it looks exactly like the spec, and now the spec changed in this way, so I know exactly where to change it and how. And I don't have to figure out like, oh, here's an interpretation of that spec. How does this spec change map to this interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's also sort of a strong motivation to use the OO paradigm, is because it allows us to do that, where we just transliterate the spec from English into um, OO programming.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, OO has lots of issues. I know that the what is it, the data oriented design people
Mm-hmm.
are very gung ho about their cache lines and data locality and whatnot. And they have a lot of good points about that. Things go faster if you put all the data in a very good way for the CPU to access.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wrong, but it's always a compromise, I think. You have to sometimes there are sacrifices that you can make, and compromises you can make where yes, we could make this thing faster, but does it even matter?
Mm.
And for the things that don't matter, I would rather our code look like the spec than our code be data oriented and really fast.